Okay, in this lesson we're going to take a look at OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. And first of all, OAuth 2, what is this? Well, this is a security standard where we give one app permission to access our data in another application. So instead of giving them a username and password, we give them a key that gives the app permission to access our data or do things on our behalf in another application. And the steps taken to grant permission is referred to as authorization. We authorize one app to access our data or use features in another app on our behalf without actually giving them our password. And we can take that key back whenever we wish. We'll have seen this before. Whenever we click on Facebook login, GitHub login, Apple login, whatever, that's what we're doing here. That uses OAuth 2.0. And the flow of this. So let's take our application that we're going to build, for example. Our user clicks on the login button because they want to do something that requires authentication in our client app. That user is then redirected to a login page on Identity Server. They log in, and Identity Server is going to check to see if they're logged in already, and they may not even see the login page. But after they've logged in, then Identity Server is going to give our client app a key, so our client app on behalf of our user can then proceed and use the functionality that requires authentication. Now, this comes with some terminology that we need to understand so that we can understand the authentication flow that is going to happen. Now, I'm going to talk about this now, but you may want to come back to this a bit later after we've implemented this, just to refresh what is going on, because Identity Server doesn't put this stuff front and center, but it is how it works behind the scenes. So first of all, we have a resource owner. That's you. You are the owner of your identity, your data, and any actions that can be performed with your account. The client is the application that wants to access data or perform actions on behalf of you, the resource owner. So after you've logged into Identity Server, in our example, our client will then be given a key so it can go and authenticate to our other services. So we have an authorization server. This is the application that knows the resource owner where the resource owner already has an account. In our example, this is going to be Identity Server. The resource server is the API or service the client wants to use on behalf of the resource owner. Sometimes this can be the same server. Sometimes it's a completely different organization. But the authorization server is a third-party service that the resource server trusts. We also have a redirect URI, and this is the URL the auth server, Identity Server, will redirect the resource owner back to after granting permission to the client callback URL. We also have a response type. This is the type of information the client is expecting to receive. The most common response type is code, where the client expects to receive an authorization code from the authorization server. We also have something called a scope. These are the granular permissions the client wants, such as access to data, so it can perform actions. We also have a consent form. You'll have seen this before if you use Facebook, login, or some other method of login. The auth server takes the scopes the client is requesting and verifies with the resource owner if they want to give the client permission. This is optional, and we will not be implementing consent in our application because we are not sharing the user's data. We just want to provide the user with the ability to access data on a resource server. We also have a client ID, and this ID is used to identify the client with the authorization server, our Identity Server. So in Identity Server, we'll be configuring clients, two of them in our case, our Next App and Postman. We also have a client secret, and this allows our client, the Next.js app, to securely share information privately behind the scenes. We also have an authorization code. This is a short-lived temporary code that the authorization server, Identity Server, sends back to the client. The client then sends the auth code back to the auth server along with the client secret in exchange for an access token. And the access token is the key the client will use from that point forward to communicate with the resource server. This is like a key or a key card that gives the client permission to request data or perform actions with the resource server on your behalf as the resource owner. So that's the terminology, and like I say, you might want to come back to this later after you've implemented it, especially if you've never come across this type of flow before. And the flow that we're using is OAuth 2.0 flow. So first of all, we want the client to access some information about you that is contained on the authorization server, which is our identity server. We are going to use our identity server to store our user accounts. So the client then redirects our browser to the authorization server that includes with the request the client ID, the redirect URL, the response type, and one or more scopes that it needs. The authorization server then verifies who you are and, if necessary, prompts for a login. Maybe you already have a session on identity server. If you do, then it will not ask you to log in again. It will simply return the token. Possibly you would have a consent form. Based on the scopes requested by the client, and the resource owner can grant or deny permission based on what the app is asking for. We're not going to implement that in our app. Next, the temporary authorization code is then passed to the user's browser, which then calls using the redirect URI to the client app server. So bear in mind, this is the user's browser, and only in 1 or 2 steps is this involved in the process. A lot of this happens behind the scenes between our client app and the authorization server. But the authorization code is sent back to the user's browser, which then uses the callback URL provided by the authorization server to redirect to the client app server. That's what's going on here. The client then contacts the authorization server directly. It does not use the resource owner's browser. It securely sends its client ID and its client secret along with the authorization code to the authorization server. And then the authorization server will respond with the access token, which is not returned to the user's browser. It is retained on the application server, the client app server, not the user's browser, as it will not be used by the user's browser directly. This is private communication between our client app server and the authorization server. And the client itself doesn't even understand what the access token is. It's just gibberish string that is sent to the resource server when requesting data. So our client app then can send this token to the auction service, for example, and ask it to give it some stuff, such as a list of auctions, for example. And behind the scenes, the auction service will verify this is a valid token, and if the token is valid, then it returns the data. Now, before any of this stuff takes place, the authorization server, identity server, establishes a relationship with the client, and the authorization server generates a client ID and client secret and gives them to the client to use for all future OAuth users. This secret must be kept secret, and only the client app and the authorization server know what this is, and this is how the authorization server can then verify the clients. Now, we also have another standard on top of OAuth 2 called OpenID Connect. OAuth 2.0 is designed only for authorization and granting access to data, and OAuth is like giving an application a key. It's useful, but it doesn't tell the client who you are or anything about you. And OpenID Connect, or OIDC, sits on top of OAuth 2 that adds additional functionality around login and profile information about the person who is logged in. It doesn't just give the client permissions, but it also includes some basic information about who you are. And OpenID Connect, or OIDC, enables a client to establish a login session as well as to gain info about the person logged in, which is often referred to as identity. And when an authorization server supports OIDC, it's often referred to as an identity provider, since it provides information about the resource owner, that's you, the user, back to the client, which is the server running our client application. And most applications that you see out there will use SSO that uses this flow, such as Facebook, such as Apple, such as Google, and other social networking services, so that users can use something they already have rather than signing up every time when they encounter a new application and use its functionality. So that's a very, very brief overview of OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0. And it's all very abstract at the moment, and it will continue to be abstract until we get this stuff up and running so that we can see it in action. And you may want to revisit the terminology of what we're doing inside here and revisit this as necessary. But next we're actually going to start building our identity server application.